We trust our medications to be effective and relatively safe because of the FDA's rigorous approval process. However, the strict testing is a fairly recent practice that was spurred from a global tragedy just over 60 years ago. The drug behind the scandal is called thalidomide.
So thalidomide was a medication that was prescribed in several places, particularly in Europe in the 1950s, for conditions including treatment of nausea and vomiting of pregnancy, so what we might call morning sickness. And it was effective at treating conditions, but it also caused terrible birth defects, so severe limb deformities and death in many cases. And we think that at least 8,000, probably more infants were affected, with 3,000 deaths.
That's Alyssa Belinsky, the Peterson Family Assistant Professor of Health Policy at Brown University. Even though the drug was never approved in America, the destruction it caused had profound effects on the FDA's evaluation system. It strengthened the agency's role in drug approvals and required manufacturers to prove the safety and efficacy in human trials.
But in part because we had this shadow of thalidomide hanging over us, this rigorous standard of evidence, even from the beginning, always made a special exception for pregnant women. Actually, initially, all women of childbearing age and not just pregnant women were excluded from drug development RCTs. And so this policy was relaxed in the 1980s. And by 1993, there became a requirement to include women in these trials. But again, that was still quite recent. And to this day, even as women are included in drug development RCTs, our research published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology emphasized that less than 1% of trials enrolling women 18 to 45 enroll pregnant participants.
It might be less of an issue if the drugs were being tested in pregnant women after the initial human clinical trials, but that's not the case. In most instances, we have no idea how medications will affect this population because no one ever researches it. It's important to mention that this hesitancy comes from a good place of wanting to keep mothers and babies safe. However, Belinsky argues that excluding this population has drastically limited scientific innovation.
So we are just starting to learn physiologically what actually causes nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. There's a lot of things we still don't know scientifically about pregnancy. So for example, we don't really understand physiologically what causes the start of natural labor. So we start by having real gaps in the basic science, and then companies that might be able to, for example, want to innovate on new medications are going to perhaps be more hesitant about developing innovations if they are working in these populations that are harder to research. So it's a really interesting pipeline challenge to think about.
Ultimately, this means that pregnant women today are left without drugs that have been proven to be safe and effective. Many times, patients are having to weigh the benefits of taking certain drugs against the potential unknown risks to their pregnancy.
And so in practice, two things happen. The first is that a lot of people choose not to take or prescribe medications when there is less evidence available. So we do see a drop off in medication usage during pregnancy. And that's because people are worried about potential adverse effects. But pregnancy isn't known for curing your asthma or curing your anxiety and depression. And in fact, pregnancy can come with a whole host of other conditions. And so it puts us in a situation where we may not be treating conditions, even though it might be more dangerous not to treat them than to treat them for both mom and for baby.
Though medication usage drops, most of this population still takes some sort of drug. In fact, the CDC reports that 9 in 10 women use some sort of medication during pregnancy.
And so the upshot is that a lot of people are still taking medications about which we don't have good data, and it's just harder to learn about potential adverse effects in ad hoc post-marketing surveillance studies compared to these really rigorous studies that typically are used to inform approval in the general population.
After presenting this work, Belinsky is often approached by women who are inspired to share their own experience of navigating this dilemma while pregnant. In one case, a woman had to decide whether to stop taking depression medication that she had been successfully on for years because there was no evidence to determine if it was safe for pregnancy.
Other people have told us about struggling to treat nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. And I think this is an interesting case because it's one that comes up a lot as I think maybe feeling less important So people say, oh, you can just tough out nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. And so one study that my colleague Natalia likes to point to is that there are estimates that last year alone, the US lost about 56 million days of work to pregnancy-related nausea and vomiting.
Which speaks to the economic impact this lack of research leads to. Now, even if clinical trials start enrolling this population, there's a chance that these women don't want to participate. However, Belensky's new research asks this question, and the preliminary results have shown that while some are hesitant, there are others who would be excited for the opportunity.
People report being willing to participate when they are already taking a medication for a chronic condition. So that person that I mentioned who was trying to figure out whether to keep taking her depression medication, she told me, I kind of wished I could have enrolled in a trial because then at least someone else would have learned from my experience. I think we're really grateful when people are willing to participate in clinical trials. It's never something that we would require someone to do, but we can think about the systems that we already have for making sure that research participants are protected as much as possible.
The question of safety isn't unique to this situation. It's a consideration for every research participant, young and old, male and female. The fact that clinical trials are the gold standard for research doesn't dismiss the challenges or risks. But Belensky says it's the best way we can learn about medications while exposing as few people as possible. To drive this point home, Belensky and her colleagues conducted research published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Their goal was to see what the impact would have been if certain drugs had been tested in pregnant women, instead of excluding them from research.
So the first case that we considered was thalidomide. And the reason that we considered it is not because we expect it to happen again, but because it looms so large as a reason for why we should be hesitant about doing research in pregnancy. What we were able to show is that if we had done a trial, even if we hadn't been able to detect these effects early enough to stop a trial early and we'd finished a trial, we still would have averted about 99.6% of all birth defects that occurred. So then what would have been the upside of doing a trial? The upside of doing a trial would have been that having a medication to effectively treat nausea and vomiting during pregnancy would be incredibly beneficial and is something that we still struggle to treat effectively to this day.
The team also included a much more recent example through looking at the COVID-19 vaccine. Even though there were advocates for including pregnant and lactating women in this research, they were still left out. This forced the community to make a decision about receiving the vaccine without any evidence of how it would affect their health. Evidence that was available to anyone else who wasn't carrying or breastfeeding a child.
And we were able to do some mathematical modeling to argue that if pregnant people had been included in trials, and as a result, there had been a moderate increase in uptake, we might have averted about 20% of maternal COVID-19 deaths and 8% of all maternal deaths from March to November of 2021, as well as 1% of stillbirths. The numbers there are inexact, but I think they're useful for illustrating the scale of potential health benefits that we could potentially achieve by running randomized trials in pregnant people.
Now, this change won't happen overnight. There are a lot of logistics and moving pieces to figure out, but thankfully, we have a good foundation to build off of. Part of our current testing standards includes a type of research called developmental and reproductive toxicology studies. The FDA currently requires most drugs to undergo these trials that specifically assess the drug's effects on reproduction and development, often in animal models. In addition, there are a few committees that have been focused on determining the best way to include pregnant and lactating women in research.
And these include recommendations focused on changing some of the regulatory language and requirements, some logistical and funding recommendations, so providing more funding and adjusting grant timelines to account for slower enrollment of pregnant individuals. They also include thinking about different requirements or guidance that could be provided about the expectation that pregnant people should be, of when pregnant people should be included and what that inclusion could look like.
And though the progress is slow moving, Belensky hopes we'll soon look back on this period with the same astonishment as when we think about the lax safety and gender testing regulations from just a few decades ago.
Remember what I talked about in the beginning, that it was only in 1962 that we started requiring companies to provide evidence that medications were safe and effective. And it was only in 1970 that that evolved into the gold standard we understand today. And it was only in 1993 that women were required to be included. That was in the very recent past. All of these were in the very recent past. And so our hope is that just like 70 or 80 years ago, we didn't have any of the system that we have today. Maybe in another 70 or 80 years, or perhaps less than that, all of these, it will seem just as antiquated to lack rigorous evidence about safety and efficacy during pregnancy.
You can find more information about Alyssa Belinsky and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.